together here and so if you guys haven't been with us, I see a couple visitors here and there. We're in Joshua chapter 5 today, and we've been going kind of at a snail's pace. I apologize for that a little bit, but we're in Joshua chapter 5. We've already talked about first couple of chapters. We went through that this book is important to the children of Israel for a few reasons. One, it's the first book of the Bible that's not written by Moses, so it's one of the first books of history that we would call it, and that's why it's important. It starts the way it does, with God at the front and center of the book, and that we see in Joshua chapter 2 that Joshua is choosing some ways to lead the children of Israel, but for the most part, we know that Joshua is listening to the commands of God. And that's the important part we know from the first couple of chapters here. We've also seen how God is willing to display His power to the children of Israel, to display His control of both the natural forces and spiritual forces that are at play here. So we see God's great display of power in the crossing of the Jordan River. We talked about how last week that wouldn't have been a crossing that they would have, any military or any people would have really considered safe or reasonable at that time because of how flooded the Jordan was due to that time of year, the rainfall and the snow melting from the mountains. And it's just too great of a risk to cross that kind of a body of water without some kind of intervention. And how Jericho would have expected that they wouldn't have been able to cross and that they were safe. But as we move into chapter 5 here, let's start in verse 1. As soon as the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan and the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted, and there was no longer any spirit in them, because of the people of Israel. So we see here, written in verse 1, following up right after, that they know, the Canaanites know what's happened. They know that there's no normal way that Israel could have crossed the river during this time of year. And they know because Israel was able to cross over and make up camp a little bit north of Jericho that God is with Israel and that there's nothing they can do about it. The God that they've heard stories about being with the children of Israel in the desert and all of the battles they fought, all of the things they experienced, all the miracles He performed that they'd heard about, that we talked about in chapter 2, that Rahab had heard about, right? The parting of the Red Sea, the 2 different battles that they had in the desert. All of those things, they were under the protection of God, and the Canaanites knew that. They knew why Israel was so successful. And they see here on full display right before their eyes, or right at their front door in the case of Jericho, that God is still with Israel. He has not abandoned them. He has not forsaken them. And that they're going to go into this conquest, into the promised land, with God behind their backs. Now, in verse 2, we start talking about some interesting things that I think, at least that chapter 5 brings to light. Okay? So in verse 2, the Lord tells Joshua that he needs to circumcise all of the men of the camp. Now, what does that mean? Right? We know what circumcision is, but you would think that having the law given to them in Exodus they would have already been doing this, right? They're supposed to do it on the 8th day. So you would think that all the men of Israel should already be circumcised. But here we see in verse 2 that that's not the case, okay? So what does this imply for the children of Israel? One, that they're not completely following the law, or at least they did it in the desert, in the wilderness, right? When they were wandering in the desert for 40 years, they didn't completely follow the law of God, and that means that their covenant with God, right? The law is the covenant with Israel. They do these things to maintain their covenant with God, and God will stay with Israel and continue to bless them. So they haven't done these things in the desert, so they need to start doing them. They need to resume their covenant with God. And so the way God asks them to start doing this again is to start with circumcision. It's what he had Abraham start with for his covenant. So it's very parallel to that in the fact that he has already made this covenant with, Abraham and with the children of Israel in the wilderness, but because they've been so unfaithful, they need to renew their covenant. They need to bring that back into good standing with their agreement with God. Okay, so in verse 2, the Lord tells Joshua to circumcise the sons of Israel. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised them at Gibeath Harloph. I probably mispronounced that really bad. And after he circumcised all of the males and the people who came out of Egypt, because all the men of war had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt, though all the people who had came out of the wilderness out of Egypt had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness had not been circumcised. So we see here, it's explained in the next couple verses why this was happening. It's not something we're guessing about, okay? It's a confirmation that they just were not faithful to God 100% to the law that Moses had given them and that they had written down at this point. Now, they've come into the land and they're circumcised, so they take a couple days to rest up. If you guys remember Genesis 34, I think in verse 25, we see some evidence that this process would have left you unable to defend yourself very easily. You guys want to turn over to Genesis 34 with me? We can look at that. So this would have been something that you wouldn't want to enter a foreign country to go into a conquest and then completely disable your fighting force. First thing you get into the country, okay? They hadn't sooner stayed over a couple days than the Lord asked them to completely cripple their ability to continue their conquest and to defend themselves in an area where you would expect, you've crossed the river, you've made up your camp. If the people of that land feel like they have any type of advantage, they're going to take it and they're going to try and run over your camp and try and kick you out of their land. So it's not something that you would want to ideally do here. Genesis chapter 34, we're going to start in verse 25. I might have wrote down the wrong one. I think I did. Do what? Yeah. Read that for me. That verse 24.
And all who went out of the gate of the city listened to Hamor and his son Shechem, and every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city. On the third day, when they were sore, two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and came against the city while it felt secure and killed all the males.
Okay, so we see here an example of when they tricked a couple of the city to circumcise themselves so they could, marry into the Israelites. And they were vulnerable for several days after they had done this. So when Israel does this to all of their men here, once they've gotten to Gilgal, they're going to be vulnerable for several days after this. And it's important to note that here they had a secure city, right? In Genesis 34, they were secured up in the walls. They thought they were safe from any kind of attack, so they felt safe to do this. Israel's not in a fortified city. They're camped out in the middle of the desert. Okay, this place where they've camped, Gilgal, it's not a city yet. That's just where they put up their tents. That's where they've made their camp, but it's not any kind of defendable position, and especially from a disadvantage. So for Joshua to be asked to do this to the children of Israel, and for the children of Israel to go through with it, is not only just keeping with the covenant of God, but it's a great display of faith by the children of Israel in God's ability to keep them safe in this land, because they would have been very vulnerable to attack at this time, and they've made a couple waves crossing the Jordan. We see that in verse 1. So verses 8 through 9, they spend their couple days healing, recuperating. And then we see that why Joshua names it Gilgal, because in verse 9 here, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." And so the name of that place is called Gilgal. And Gilgal sounds very similar to the Hebrew word for roll away, or to roll away. So that's why it's called that. Frank?
When we look at the book of Joshua, with all the problems that are happening today, we see the answer right there. The land of Israel was at weak, and most people today don't even know of Israel was its name. It is named after the fathers of the land, which is Jacob, and the land should be given to no one else. It is left to no one else but Simeon, Levi, Judah, Zebulun, Isaac, Dan, Asher, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin. If you notice, Joshua divided the land. He said it should be left only for the 12 tribes of Israel. So while they was in the wilderness wandering, God was preparing the land for them to return. And when they returned, Joshua was the one who put in place to divide that land. And I said, it shall be divided to the families of the 12 tribes, no one else. To Reuben, to Dan, as I said, to the 12 tribes.
Yeah.
So once you was not part of the 12 tribes, you would not, or you was not supposed to be in the land of Israel.
Yeah, so they're just starting to come into their promise
Sorry,
here. Yeah.
in verse 8 it said, in verse 10, no, sorry, it said, the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers that he would give us. So God has sworn to Jacob, that land will be yours, and it shall be left for your generation forever.
Yeah, and we see that that's starting to come into play right now, that that God's starting to fulfill that promise, and how they're going to go about it, we're going to see is going to be through listening to God and keeping with His covenant. Okay. We see in verses 10 and 11 here, the people of Israel kept Passover at Gilgal. So they from a conquest standpoint, it almost looks like they invaded a country and took a vacation. Okay, they've crossed the Jordan River with their army, and they've set up camp, and now they've just taken a break for the last 10 or 15 days. Okay, because they circumcised the men, they took a couple days to rest, and then they had Passover after that. And Passover, if you guys remember, was kind of a week-long deal. Now, it wouldn't have been the same kind of festival that we would have seen, Passover in Jesus' time, because they would have had less time to set up and less resources, less luxury. But it was still something that they took very seriously. And I think it's important to set the the mindset of how Israel is approaching this too is they are putting God first, right? We saw it at the front of the book. They put chapter 1 a little bit out of order contextually, just so that they have God starting to be the focus. And here we see them cross the Jordan, and they can smell Jericho just a couple of miles down the road, but they're taking the time to not only honor God's wishes by going through with circumcision and renewing their covenant with Him, but then they follow up with Passover, which is a festival they're commanded to keep to remember what He did for them in Egypt. So they've taken time here at the front end of their conquest to think about God and to honor Him in a way that I think that really Christians should take example from, right? One of the habits we are in, at least I'm in, or I was raised to be in, we say a prayer before a meal, right? And it's just a habit. You're not supposed to pray before every meal. You're not commanded to, but it's something that I was raised to do, and it's very similar to what they're doing here, right? Before you start doing what you're doing, ask yourself, or just take a moment and talk with God. Just take that moment, dedicate it to God before you start doing what you're doing. It doesn't have to be a meal time, right? It could be you're going to go on a drive, right? You're going to go to your in-laws' house. You're going to go see the grandkids, and before you go on that drive, just take a minute and say a prayer, or read a scripture. They always took this time at the front end of what they were doing that was dedicated to God, because God was first. And whenever they put God first, we see them blessed for that, okay? It's when they start putting Him on the back end of things or forgetting about Him that we really start seeing Israel lose focus of what they're doing and who they are, and we see God start to not be as generous with His blessings and be more reprimand them more for what they're doing, because they're not keeping God at the focus. He's more of an afterthought and less of a forethought. So here we see them come into the land. God tells them to circumcise, and they go through the Passover, and they haven't even figured out how they're going to conquer Jericho yet, okay? Because it's a very fortified city, and this is the mid Bronze Age, okay? I don't know how many of you guys watch the History Channel or anything, but that time period was not known for its great strategies of war, okay? The biggest thing that you had in combat was a chariot, and a chariot's not very good when you got walls, right? Because the horses are just going to run around the city, and nobody cares, okay? So as far as military conquest, sieges have not been very well developed. The types of materials and the strategies they use for sieges that we see, displayed in movies and TV now, it wasn't very common or popular, and you had to have a lot of resources and time to set that up. And we don't see the children of Israel having either of those in this kind of setting. So they've taken this time, and instead of setting up and preparing for war, they're taking time and they're remembering what God has done for them. We see in verse 13, I almost skipped over something. Verse 12, the manna stops, okay? After they come into the land, they're able to take from the produce of the land. And we see that the Lord stops letting manna fall from heaven. That's a sign both to Israel and from God to them, I guess, that this is the promise. You have finally entered into the promised land, and you can now experience what that means. And so they're going to be taking from the fruits of the land, and from the people they conquer. They're going to take food from the cities and stuff like that. So they're going to get to experience what their promised land has to offer, the land of milk and honey, right? So they're going to get to experience that during their conquest here. So moving to verse 13, we see Joshua's by Jericho, and he sees a man standing before him with a sword drawn. And that's usually, in this time period, if you got your sword drawn, you're ready to fight. And Joshua's not sure who he's ready to fight, okay, because they're there to conquer Jericho. So Joshua asks him in verse 13, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" Right? Just trying to identify who this guy is. And he says, "No." All right. So I ask you, are you for me, or are you for the guys that I'm with? And your response is no. What is that supposed to mean, right? Okay. Well, he doesn't stop at no, but in my Bible, it's separated by a semicolon. I don't know if it is in yours, and that's not super common, but it's implied here that it's two separate statements, okay? So he is saying no to Joshua's question just in its entirety, okay? He is not with Israel, and he is not with or for the people that he is trying to conquer, Jericho. So who is he with? "I have come now as a captain of the army of the Lord." Okay, so here we see what we can infer. It's not really told to us that it is an angel, but this is what we would see in other places in Scripture written down as an angel of the Lord. Okay, this is the commander of the armies of the Lord, and when Joshua is asking him, "What are you here for?" he's here to lead the armies of the Lord. Now, what that means to me here reading it, and it's kind of with that no up front, kind of threw up a red flag for me, is that he's here to do the Lord's will. Okay? We talked about how the children of Israel have so far kept the Lord in focus, but here we have an angel of the Lord come down to really set things straight. He says, "I'm here to do what the Lord wants, regardless of who's with me or against me." He's here to do what God needs to be done. And if the children of Israel are on his side, then that's good for the children of Israel. But if they're not, then it's going to be bad for them, okay? And I think that Joshua would have understood this too, okay? His initial response, no, would have sent that message. And Joshua would have been very understanding of what this man is saying. He's not saying he is for the children of Israel. He's going to help them out in the conquest. He is here to do what God wants to be done. And whatever God tells him to be done is what will be done. So it's kind of like the enemy of my enemy, but not really. It's a better version of that, but that's kind of what's happening here, okay? Joshua's, he talks to this guy, and he says, "No, I'm the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell with his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And here we see, I see a capital here in that one. On mine, it's lowercase. How many of you guys have a different casing in your Bible for the word Lord here? Who you got? Show of hands. Capital, lowercase. Capital. Okay. So there is a little bit of question or debate whether this is actually an angel or whether it is possibly Jesus that is talking to Joshua here. And given that, Jesus' earthly form in the New Testament shares a name with Joshua, I kind of think that would be really cool and ironic. But in my Bible here, it's lowercase. So I'm not 100% sure about whether or not it is Christ here. And it's kind of one of those things that's really debated a lot in we're talking about people breaking it down and wanting to say who he's talking to here. So it is a messenger from the Lord, whether it is the Lord himself or not. It's not clear. One of the reasons why they say that too is because following up here in verse 15, he tells him to take off his shoes or his sandals because the place that he's standing on is holy ground. And the last time we heard this it's Moses with God talking to him from the burning bush. But we also know that in the burning bush, the bush was, it was an angel of the Lord speaking, right? It wasn't God speaking directly to him. It wasn't the physical form of God there. So it could be some kind of message relayed like that. So it could be just the holy ground is significant of the words being said by God. But we're not, at least biblical scholars don't agree 100% whether or not this is Jesus that he's talking to or whether it's an angel of the Lord. But regardless, the message is from God, and that's what's to be heard, right? And so the angel or Jesus here, the messenger of the Lord, is here to tell Joshua what to do next. And he tells him how to take Jericho. Okay? Moving on to chapter 6 here. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and its mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. You shall do it for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear the trumpets and the ram's horns and the ark. And on the 7th day you shall march around 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpet. And when all the people shout with a great shout, the wall of the city will fall down flat." So here we see God describe what they need to do to conquer Jericho, okay? And this kind of reminds me of some of the things that some of the examples we see in the Bible of other things God tells people to do to enact some kind of miracle. We see the man that washes in the Jordan 7 times. He's kind of like, why the Jordan? It's disgusting and filthy. It's kind of similar to that here, because what they do is they get in a parade, or what he's telling them to do is they get in a parade and they march around the city one time and then they go back to camp. And like I was saying earlier, this is the Middle Bronze Age. We don't have highly developed siege warfare yet, but typically when you siege a city, you surround it, right, with your forces, with your armies. And it may not be in a literal man-to-man, shoulder-to-shoulder surrounding, but you surround it with, small camps and people to watch, see if people are leaving, coming, if there's any way to get into the city. So for them to march around the wall once and then go back to their camp is kind of unusual. It's not something that you would expect a military to do at this time, okay? It's not a tactic that's going to work out to their favor. They're just patrolling the city once a day. If the people of Jericho wanted to, at night they could have opened the doors and snuck out, because the children of Israel aren't standing guard there, okay? It's a very unusual way to ask someone to siege a city. So, and it's not, you're not building ladders to climb the walls, you're not building any kind of battering rams, it's just walking around the city. So, in the way that God has asked them to do this, not only does it set an example, it's just reminding them every day, right? God is going to do something miraculous to help you conquer this city. You're not going to take it by your own force, by your own display of, military prowess. God is handing you this city, okay? Because Israel does nothing, literally, really, as far as military conquest. They do nothing for 6 days, and then the walls fall down, okay? So we see, as soon as Joshua is told this, he tells the people, the leaders, he says, "This is what we're going to do." There's no second doubt. There's no question. He's not as sassy as Moses is talking to the burning bush, right? Moses has got all these excuses and ideas. Joshua gets it done, right? The Lord says, "Do this," and Joshua says, "Okay, let's do it." So he tells the leaders in verse 8, he commands them exactly what the messenger of God tells him to do. So for the first 6 days, They go out and they march around the city, and then they go back to camp. It's not an exciting day if you're in the military. Now, marching around the city would not have taken all that long, okay? In my head, I had Jericho to be this, bigger city. I didn't have it to be, I guess, the size of St. Augustine, but it wasn't a small city in my head either. So, you're marching around the city, it's going to take a while. Historically, Jericho would have been, they estimate, between 10 and 20 acres. Okay, the actual walled portion of the city would have been pretty small. Okay, now that's not saying there's not that many people there, because the people in the surrounding areas would have had, houses outside of the gates, farms, other things that they would have been tending. And all of those people, in a time of conquest, watching an army cross the river, you're going to go to the nearest safe place, right? And that's Jericho. So they've prepared for siege. I don't know how well you can see it here on this image here. This is based on archaeological data they found at the ancient city there. The new city, I guess the modern city of Jericho, is not where the ancient city is, just kind of little ways away. Right here is a tree. That really helped me for perspective, because you see a shot like this, you don't know how high up they are, but that's a tree. This would have been kind of where the city gate is, and we would have seen it go around not too far, right? You would have been able to, if you had bird's eye view or a really nice tower, you probably could have seen the whole city. Okay, so walking around it would not have taken all day, probably would have taken a couple hours at most. And I think with 40,000 people, you could pretty well encircle this city, right? So the fact that they're able to walk around it, and then they decide to go home after, they could just, set up camp. Everybody gets a stone, right, to watch for the night. So it's not a very big area. They can do it really quickly. And that's why, on the seventh day, you march around it 7 times. It's not going to take forever, okay? It's going to take a little bit longer than usual. Might take you till lunchtime if you start early. But it wouldn't have been a terrible amount of walking. And you wouldn't have had, you would have had a lot of daylight left to do what you needed to do. So we see 12 through 18 here, I think. 12 through, got ahead of my notes. 12 through 16, 12 through 15, that they're doing this. And in verse 18, Joshua is giving them the commands for the last day. Okay, he says what they're going to do. But you're to keep yourselves from things devoted to destruction, lest when you've devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction, and bring trouble upon it. But all silver and gold, and every vessel of bronze and iron, are holy to the Lord, and they shall go into the treasury of the Lord. And with that, the people shout, and the walls fall down. Okay, so Joshua is telling them right here, in the heat of battle, or before it gets started really, what they're to do, right? Israel is supposed to devote the entire city to destruction. Man, woman, child, cat, everything, okay? The only things that they're allowed to take are food and supplies for the camp. Anything like gold, silver, valuables, they're to be completely destroyed, okay? Burned up. And this is going to be important coming up, because we see that not everyone, follows the rules, and what that has consequences for, okay? So we see Joshua tell them right here at the front end, so there's no excuses. You're to leave everything alone, just all the treasure and jewelry and everything else. That is to be devoted to God as a sacrifice. And here the word they use for devoted in Hebrew is similar to sacrifice, okay? It's to set apart, like to consecrate. So it would have, devoted means to make a sacrifice for here. So, and the things that are devoted to destruction, it's in a similar way. I think it's one of the reasons why they burned the city too. It's a burnt offering representative more here. And we see historical evidence of the city being burned too. The archaeological surveys, the picture I showed you, that what that was based on, a lot of them find that the last period that Jericho was occupied ended in a burning. Go figure. The city was razed to the ground, and then it was not occupied again from historical data, okay? The historical evidence shows that, the last layer had charred debris, smoke marks, things like that give evidence of the city being completely burned. So the children of Israel follow the Lord's commands here. We've got the archaeological evidence if you didn't want to believe the Bible. So we see that they complete the conquest. He tells them that they also must leave. If you haven't forgotten, chapter 2, Rahab and everybody in her house. Okay. And if you remember, so this casemate wall here, that outer section would have been what fell down. The inner section, you see with the little portholes, the little ways into the rooms and the houses on the inside, the interior, those probably would have stood. Because if the whole thing fell, right, Rahab's house probably would have collapsed on itself. So it wouldn't have been very safe for the inhabitants of that. And as far as, conquest and, once you got away into the city, you don't need a huge opening. It doesn't have to be a wide open field. If you got a couple doors, you see how wide, I'm pointing the wrong way. You see how wide these houses are and how many holes they've got, in this 15, 20-foot section. That's enough for 3 or 4 guys to get in. And if you got those all the way around the city, it's not going to really impede your flow, okay? So whether the entire city outer wall of structure, I guess, of the houses and the walls fell, or whether it was just the outer wall fell, I'm not really sure. The Bible doesn't say exactly. But we know that Rahab's family survived, so I would think that it's just this outer wall that fell, and that would have been a way too that she could have still had the scarlet cord, so they knew, where to not go, where to not attack. We see that he sends the spies, Joshua sends the spies here to go and get them out of the house, to take them out of the city safely. Once Israel starts rushing in, their job is to get them out because they made that promise to Rahab that they were going to save her and her whole family. And it's best not to leave things to chance when you've got an army rushing through a city. Not everyone may not have seen the scarlet cord if they came in from the other side of the building. Okay, so he went ahead and sent the spies in to get them out. And once they do, the promise is fulfilled for Rahab. Here in verse 24, they burned the city with fire, everything in it, only the silver or gold, the vessels of bronze and iron, they put in the treasury of the house of the Lord. 25, Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive, as she has lived in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers that Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. 26 is an important part for later in the Bible, but not really here in Joshua. And Joshua laid an oath on them at the time, saying, "Cursed be before the Lord any man who rises up to rebuild this city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundations, and at the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." In verse 27, so the Lord was with Joshua, and all his fame was, and his fame was in all the land. Okay, so Jericho would have been a very powerful city-state for this time period. To see Jericho so completely destroyed like this would have had the Canaanites shaking in their boots. You talk about towns like Jerusalem and other major fortified cities at the time, they would have been afraid. Okay, they're aware of what Jericho's military strength would have been, and how well they could have withstood a siege for the time period. And the fact that it's so utterly and completely destroyed after less than a week of siege would have been terrifying, okay? Because you don't know what they've got, what they did, other than the city's completely burned and destroyed. So but Canaan is afraid, and Joshua lays this curse. If you guys are curious and you want to read on your own, we're kind of getting up here towards the end. That curse, you see it played out in 1 Kings chapter 16, okay? Starting in verse 30 or 34. If you want to read that on your own, you can. This curse Joshua puts on Jericho in verse 26. That's where we see the other half of it. Which you never want to see a curse like that fulfilled, but I think it's interesting that we see it done before the time of the second exile, when the children of Israel are removed. Okay, so I think it's interesting that happens even before. Just kind of another sign that Israel had fallen that far, that they completely had either forgotten or disregarded this curse that Joshua had put on it entering. We're getting here towards the end. We have any questions for chapter 6, Jericho? Jesse?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch on this declaration here, like verse 19, for instance, where it said that the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a good passage to help us see one description of holiness. You know, I think, personally, I can often view it as, right, God's holy, He's righteous, He's perfect, and of course we're called to be holy. A lot of times we can feel like, well, I'm not perfect and
Right.
always, godly all the time. Try to be, but here the idea is it's just to be set apart, specifically for God. And, certainly holiness holds that connotation, and viewing it in that way can help us, I think.
Yes.
Try to live out holiness too. So anyway, good passage.
I agree. That's definitely a good one. And when I was talking about in your Bible when it says devoted, that word is similar to, but not exactly the same as this word holy, but they have a very similar meaning. So it's a different way to think about holy, as in, we kind of use holy explicitly when we're talking about, Jesus and God and how righteous they are, but I think we're maybe transposing that sometimes too. At least I do. Thank you, Jesse.
Relating to that, there's something really interesting at the end of verse 23. When they pull Rahab, all her relatives, she did this amazing thing where she saved her family by telling these spies, and harboring these spies. But that concept of holiness still was in the camp, because she's not allowed to be in the camp of Jerusalem.
Right.
She's not an Israelite. And so
Yeah,
even that concept of holiness
that's a good
is
point.
there, where she's not even allowed in the camp.
Mm-hmm.
And we do find later on that she lives in Israel, so there's some point in which she proselytizes.
Right.
Her family, she ends up in the lineage of Jesus. But it's fascinating to me that she made this choice, but that choice did not make her right with God. It protected
Right.
her in this instance.
It
Later on,
protected
she
her
makes
from
choices
destruction.
wrong with God.
Yeah, but it didn't give her a free pass.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. All right, we will get to chapter 7 and following next week.